he was a Rhodes Scholar. Mayor Buttigieg will be interviewed today by Anna Marie Cox, who is the host of the Crooked Media podcast with friends like these. Anna is also a political columnist and cultural critic whose writing has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, GQ, and Sports Illustrated, among other publications. 15 years ago, she founded the political blog Wonkette. Please join me in welcoming Mayor Pete Buttigieg and Anna Marie Cox.
Hi.
All right.
So I want to say it's not just presidential candidates that can pander. I want to show off my new tattoo, which is homage to my Texas roots. It's a little literal, sorry. Yeah.
Nice.
All right.
Roots, literally.
Roots.
I like it.
Now let's get to your pandering.
Thanks a lot.
Well, I mean, it's the time. It's the season. So you would be many firsts as president. You would be the first millennial president. You would be the first only child president. You'd be the first Maltese American. You'd be the first president to transition directly from being mayor. I would argue you'd be the first president to have served in a war that is still going on, although technically not, I guess. And I guess there's another first in there somewhere which might also be relevant. You can feel free to fill that in. Which of these things do you think is the most relevant to being president?
I don't know. I never thought about the only child thing. I didn't know that. I didn't know that was. If you think out of 45, that would have happened.
FDR had a half brother that was 27 years older.
Okay. All right. So we're close. That's a good sign. I like FDR.
Yeah, you and FDR. Oh, close. Okay.
No, I think definitely the fact of having served in a conflict that's going on right now. I mean, the fact of having served, period. I think this gives you a sense of perspective about the presidency, but also about politics in general, which is that understanding that and it's part of the case I make in the book, that the reason politics matters is not in its own terms, in the kind of show of it, but in the impact it has on everyday life. And when you get orders to go overseas on the orders of a president, I think you intuitively understand for the rest of your life what's at stake in political decisions.
So I'm going to assume a lot of people ask you where you get the nerve to run for president after being just a mayor. And I don't want to repeat those questions, except I do have to ask, so where do you get the nerve to run for president? Like, you're barely old enough to drink, I gather. So...
Look, first of all, I get it. And...
I assume you have like a 60-second planned.
Yeah, you just want to hear that? Or, I mean, look, when you think about the presidency and the demands of the presidency and the intensity of it, there's something obscene about anybody thinking that they just belong in that office. And yet every single
There's something obscene about people who have maybe currently
One might argue, yeah. But look, every one of those people, the good ones and the bad ones, they've all been obviously mortals, people who walked into that office based on some combination of things they were good at and experiences they'd had. And the experiences that I've had as a mayor at a level, and I see some of my fellow mayors from around the country are here right now.
Shout out to the mayors.
There we go.
Now, is everyone applauding a mayor? Or, okay.
What's up?
Just like mayors. I was actually wondering if everyone applauding was a mayor.
Mayor, future mayor,
yeah.
No, but if you're a mayor of a city of any size, then you know that you have a sense of urgency and immediacy, not just because it's an executive role in government, but it is, I would argue, the indispensable executive role in government. You don't, for example, you're not going to hear about a city where there's a mayor having an ideological disagreement over policy, shutting down. Like, that doesn't happen. It can't, right? We deliver water. You need water to live. So if we ever stopped doing that, you'd have about 18 hours before civilization would start to break down in that geography. So we just get it done. And I think the experiences of a mayor as an executive really maps onto the three things that the presidency is about. Capably running an administration, one. Two, formulating good policies. And then three, the most intangible but the most important, which is the kind of moral role of just bringing people together and summoning them to their highest values, especially in challenging times. Now, since you asked about my kind of canned thing that I tend to say, the other thing I like to point out when people ask about experience is that I have more government experience than the President of the United States.
That's such a low bar.
And if you think that's a low bar, I also have more executive government experience under my belt than the Vice President of the United States. And more military experience than anybody to walk into that office since George H.W. Bush. So as cheeky as it is, as the 37-year-old youngest guy in the conversation, my simplest answer to the question of why somebody like me deserves to have a voice in this conversation is experience.
Where were you when Martin O'Malley was trying to make that argument? That's the poor guy. I also want to ask, where do you get the nerve to run for president on a slightly more personal level, which you kind of point out. There's something obscene about even thinking you can do the job. Like, where does your nerve come from? Like, this confidence or this belief that you can do it, where do you think that comes from for you?
Well, first of all, having had...
Is it because people, like, shot at you? Like, now you're, like, ready to,
I think there's something about incoming rocket fire that kind of clarifies your sense of who you are and where you fit in the world. I also think that when you have a lot of responsibility placed in your hands, like a fearsome amount, and to me that was true when I had the responsibility of driving a vehicle between Kabul and Bagram and being responsible for everybody in it getting to where they're going alive. Or obviously the responsibility of being a mayor and being in charge of a $300 million budget and getting the phone call on anything from a hot Parks and Rec controversy, which happens, to,
What kind of hot is that? Like Rob Lowe hot, or just...
Let's just go with controversial.
Okay.
We had a ferocious battle over a duck pond that I won't take you in through. So you
Duck
have moments like that are right out of Parks and Recreation, right? And then you get a phone call about a racially explosive officer-involved shooting, and you've got to figure out how to get on television and reassure the community before something worse happens. And any given minute, something flips from an economic development debate to an aircraft crashing into a neighborhood. I mean, you see it all. And so having had that experience, I'm not saying it makes me think that it's easy to leap to that level, but I understand what you do when that happens, which is you bring your best experience, you bring your aptitude, and then you have the humility to know that the best thing you can do is find people who can contribute. Find people who are smarter than you about whatever particular issue you're trying to manage. Listen to them. Be able to identify the consensus among them. And when there isn't a consensus among them, be able to make a measured decision in situations where there's no right answer. There's no way to make somebody better off without making somebody else worse off. And these are the things that I think prepare you for executive leadership. You have to have a balance of audacity and humility to even seek that role, but certainly to do it well.
Let's drill down a little bit onto something you mentioned there, which is having to speak to people after an officer-involved shooting. I know people who have had to deal with officer-involved shootings, and for a few of them, coming at it from a progressive standpoint and then entering into a government situation, it was a real education in how this stuff, there's one way those things look like from a protester's point of view, another way they look like from a mayor's point of view. Did you have any moment of clarity in having to go through that? Did you learn anything about what those situations, tragic and controversial that they are? Did you learn something that you didn't know before?
Well, certainly I think you understand both perspectives more acutely. Not that there's just two, but both kinds of perspectives more acutely when you're in that seat. You understand the perspective of officers when you've been there, when they're getting sworn in and their families are at their sides, and when you go through the trainings that they go through, and we work to make sure those trainings became better over time for split-second decisions. But also when you are going to neighborhood meetings, when you're accountable to people who do not feel safe in their own city and do not trust the very officers charged with keeping them safe. If I ever had a moment of clarity, there was another racial police controversy that thankfully did not involve shootings, but it was very difficult in our city to navigate. And the biggest thing I realized then was that early on I was hung up on these kind of technical, procedural, legal reasons for why I was making some choices that I made. And it took me a while to realize that what was at stake for so many people in the community wasn't the finer, basically it wasn't about whether I was right. it was about how much trust they could have in the city, in me, in officers, in each other. And that was what was really at stake. And that was freighted by more than 100 years worth of experience between local law enforcement and people of color. And many of the most frightful injustices perpetrated against people of color came at the hands of local law enforcement. So we think about this as kind of a national story around what's happening with race, and yet sometimes it is so acutely local, because that's where these harms and sometimes these healings actually happen.
That story kind of gets us to something that you come back to again and again in the book, which is that politics is personal, policy is personal, that living through something can kind of change the way you feel about policy or clarify policy for you. And with that in mind, I actually want to go through some of the issues that are facing America today, like hot-button crises, and maybe hear from you like what your personal intersection is into that crisis. I want to start actually with sexual violence, the Me Too movement. Something doesn't get talked a lot about in our presidential debates, but something is top of mind for a lot of people these days. Like, is there something that has intersected with your life?
Yeah, I mean, there are people I love who've been impacted by sexual violence. There are people I've worked with, especially students at the university, who found a lot of courage to raise their voice about this issue, who I work to try to find a way that the community could be supportive of them as well. And, you know, another thing about being a mayor is you're also an employer, right? So you're constantly thinking about, just for the workforce that you manage, how do you create and structure an environment where people are not afraid, where people's concerns are taken seriously, where this sort of thing is clearly unacceptable, and when something unacceptable does happen, where it's adjudicated in a fair way. And sometimes these things, they're not obvious on day one, how to handle them well. I mean, America's still figuring this out. And sector by sector, it's starting to happen. It's interesting that some sectors are getting there faster than others. I'm waiting for the Me Too movement in finance, for example. I think it hasn't happened as quickly as it did in Hollywood or in politics, because reputation is such an important part of Hollywood and of politics. And when we hit a tipping point about what we were willing to accept in terms of sexual harm and sexual intimidation, people were, in a sense, punished in terms of reputation even before the legal system successfully dealt with those cases. Finance is a little different, but you've got to believe, look, any place where there is power, there is abuse. And I've got to believe that there is a reckoning eventually coming in the financial world around the relationship between power, money, and abuse, especially sexual abuse.
Do you have any thoughts about how we begin to reconcile ourselves with each other in the wake of this movement?
Well, the word you used, I think, is a really important one, reconciliation. And, you know, there's a really interesting model at a public level in how South Africa responded to its generational harms through a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I mean, this is also part of the Catholic tradition, right? This idea of confession. There's got to be something about truth-telling and the search for forgiveness. And at the same time, I think we've had some folks believe they can kind of get on the path to forgiveness a little more quickly than we're ready to accept, especially in the entertainment world.
Well, I think people confuse like confession with forgiveness, or
Yes.
like being caught.
Right. Yeah, that's right. And it also
something.
matters how we find out about these
Yeah.
abuses, when somebody comes forward or when somebody is caught. So we don't have that figured out. But I think that just the opening of this conversation that's happened is healthy, painful, but healthy.
In the same vein, an issue that is very close to my personal life and something that affects more people than maybe we realize, which is the opioid epidemic and addiction. Where is that intersection for you?
With my life? You know, there are several different intersections that have happened. I mean, one, you know, someone I went to high school with, we lost to an overdose. A friend and supporter, a doctor, a pain doctor, was killed, shot by somebody who had basically lost their mind over access to pain medications. And so just from a community perspective, we've seen it like so many other communities have. and again, people I love who have dealt and struggled with prescription drugs. But I would also say, having recently had an experience with my father's end of life, where fentanyl was an absolute blessing. I mean, it was a legitimate part of pain management in the hospital. And so we need to make sure that we are not going to increase suffering by pressuring doctors never to touch these medications. And at the same time, holding companies that did the wrong thing, and there's lots of evidence of this, and we're actually party to a lawsuit on this, holding them accountable, as well as all of the things we got to do to deal with the opioid epidemic, which involves everything from making sure that medication-assisted therapy is more widely available, to making sure that there are interveners to come in when you're at the bedside of somebody who is brought back. We bring somebody back, our fire department does with Narcan, for example. They survive an overdose, they're in the hospital, and then we get them signed up for rehab in 6 weeks or in 3 weeks. And we just expect them to make it from here to there. Clearly, we've got to have more interventions to bridge that gap while we're working on chiseling away at the wait list. So that's something I've seen. I mean, I've talked to people who've been in that gap, and I've talked to people who've stepped up, including people with addiction issues themselves, and been willing to volunteer to be those interveners to help coach people, and we've structured a whole program around that in South Bend. I guess the last and probably the most harrowing experience that I had related to overdoses was not about opioids, it was about cannabinoids, but I was leaving an event in South Bend in a neighborhood, and I saw this young man lying on the ground, and somebody was standing over him with a cell phone trying to figure out what the address was to call 911. And I thought he was having an epileptic seizure. Foam was coming out of his mouth, he's sort of twitching. I thought he was having a seizure until I saw the other two. And that was when I realized there's 3 young men prostrate, puking. This is an overdose. And the EMTs got there, and as far as I know, all 3 young men survived. But, I mean, I had one of them rolled up against my shin so that he did not choke, so that, as he was vomiting, that went onto the ground. And you don't forget something like that. And it motivates you to try to figure out what we as a society have missed, that this is so widespread.
Yeah, that's sort of what I'm hoping to kind of get at with each of these questions is I feel like you've actually said in interviews that Democrats are too quick to hop on policy positions.
Yeah.
So I felt like that was a great out for me, that I don't have to try to nail you down on policy positions. But I wanted to try to figure out like how you get to your policy positions and how and if you change your mind, how you change your mind. There is one more thing I want to ask about as far as a personal intersection, because I think this is one that doesn't get talked about enough on presidential debate stages, and definitely not in the context of lived experience, which is climate change.
Yeah.
How is climate change real for you?
Well, I remember a night when I was going to bed, and we get these summer storms in South Bend. It's like on the radar, it looks like this red shard with green on either side of it, and it's a big squall line, and it pushes through in about 20 minutes. You get this ferocious storm wind that's very exciting, and then it's gone, and the sun comes out. And I went to bed during one of those downpours. And I rolled over a few minutes later, and I heard that gushing rain, longer than the few minutes you usually have it. And I rolled back over and I went to sleep. And then half an hour later, I realized it was still raining like that. And about an hour after that, I was in the Emergency Operations Center in South Bend, and we were preparing for what we realized was going to be major flash flooding as a consequence of what we were then being told was about a 1,000-year rainfall event. And then the next morning, it happened to be the day before school started. So I was just going around to different spots. A council member from a low-income neighborhood on the west side said, "You got to see what's happening on Frederickson Street." I get there, and houses are just, their basements had been just basically imploded by the pressure of the water. They were nowhere close to the river, but the street had just flooded, and it just destroyed some of these houses. And I'm talking to this family. Their kids have bedrooms in the basement, and there's toys and laundry baskets floating cartoon style in the water. And mom's saying, like, what am I supposed to do to get the kids ready for school? And I remember thinking, this is climate change. I mean, we don't know every individual storm, but the fact that a similar storm happened and a similar flood happened 18 months later, right, 2,000-year rainfall events, or flooding events, tells you that something's going on. And I thought if the B-roll on CNN when they're talking about climate change were less likely to be some piece of ice hunking off the Antarctic ice shelf and more likely to be a family on Frederickson Street trying to figure out what to do, maybe we'd be having a better conversation about this. That this is not happening in the Arctic to the Arctic. It's happening globally, and it's hitting us in our homes, in our neighborhoods, in the Midwest. We're not even coastal, let alone what's going in coastal cities, let alone California, parts of which are catching on fire, right?
Texas
So
also.
we've got to concretize climate. Yeah. And the searing image in my mind when I think climate change is that family trying to figure out what they're going to do.
Yes, so speaking of making things concrete in these intersections, now hearing a few cases of where, policy crises intersect with your life, I'm wondering if there's an example that you can think of having gone through something that's changed your position on policy.
I definitely have a better appreciation for the burdens that we impose with any number of regulations or orders. One had to do with a situation where I had to declare an emergency to keep everybody off the streets because it was so cold. This is a little different than the way you would approach a snowstorm probably in Austin. But for us, if the temperature is going to persistently, if it's only going to be 6 inches of snow, or if it's only 0 degrees or warmer than 0 degrees, we can handle it. It's
only 0 degrees for the Texas audience, yes.
But we had a situation where it was like minus 30 and a lot of snowfall, which meant if somebody was in a fender bender, they might die, right, just from the cold. And so we took the extraordinary step of shutting down the city. Not just saying, like, stay off the streets, but, like, total emergency order. If you're driving and it's not an emergency, we're giving you a ticket kind of thing, which is extremely rare. And it was the right thing to do, but afterwards I heard about how many businesses we had disrupted and how many problems that had created that we never thought about, people not knowing whether they were supposed to go to work anyway because they were kind of sort of essential or not. And we had a second case where we thought a similar weather event was coming, but in the end it didn't. We declared the emergency. It turned out not to be the right answer. And so it was just a moment. I'm not sure it changed a policy outlook, but it reminded me of the costs. Anytime we impose a regulation, by the way, we're regulated too, right? I run, among other things, a water utility. So I know all about what it's like to be on the other end of EPA regulations, and I get how much work has to go into living up to them. But we also recognize that there's a reason those regulations are there.
So what is the biggest thing you've ever changed your mind about?
Wow. Well, I changed my mind about Mike Pence. Because I thought, look, part of your job as a mayor is to work with people across the aisle. I pride myself on working with people across the aisle. There's lots of Republicans that I know who, are good people, and we try to find some kind of common ground where we can. And I knew that I would have, I'm now on my third Republican governor. So a really important part of...
If they're yours, can you trade them in?
I don't know what the prize is.
My third Republican governor.
But, so you learn to work across the aisle.
Right.
And you look for partnerships. And I did that with Governor Daniels, and I did that with Governor Pence, and I do it with Governor Holcomb. But I thought when I first got to know him that this was an example of somebody who has kind of different ideas, but basically we're kind of sort of in the same reality, that at least he kind of might understand where I'm coming from, and I might get to where I can understand where he's coming from. And we worried about his kind of social views, but thought maybe we can just keep him focused on economics. And there are some things that you can get an alliance of, business folks and labor and just make something happen in the economy. And then this so-called religious freedom, basically license to discriminate bill happened. And you could just see this look in his eyes, that he was now in a place where somebody like me could never reach him. And I see it sometimes when he's standing behind the president, that he's just in a different place.
I want to hear more about this. Like, when you say he's in a different place, like, do you mean finally getting to exact the biblical revenge he's always wanted to? Do you mean...
Well, yeah, kidding apart, it's
oh, okay, that's what you mean.
Well, look, there's only two possible explanations. This guy teamed up with the least, I mean, by most of our measures, I think, the least Christian figure imaginable to be running for president, right? Especially if, I mean, never mind.
He loves the Bible. It's like
my
almost as good as
conception.
Art of the Deal.
Yes, he signed it, like
Yeah.
he wrote it. Great.
Yeah.
I don't know what I would do if somebody asked me to sign
A Bible?
a Bible. I guess I would do it. Anyway, look.
Does anyone have a Bible? Let's quick, like, make him sign it.
So, not just based on my understanding of Scripture, which is about clothing the naked and feeding the hungry and looking after the immigrant, and as Gary Will said, protecting the poor from the violence of the rich, right? That's my understanding of the gospel. But even if you have more of a kind of Mike Pence kind of understanding, where apparently it's all about keeping gay people from doing gay things and you know, making sure that
everybody uses the right bathroom.
Yeah, it's all about sexual constraints. Let's put it that way, right?
Kind of like a weirdo that
Or at
way.
least that's a big part of it, right?
Yeah.
Like everybody's supposed to conform to a very rigid, arguably Old Testament style set of sexual norms, right? And of all the presidents he's going to team up with, he finds this one. The guy who's literally paying off a porn star to deal with an affair that he had. Somebody who's, I mean, I don't need to, we all know. So the question, of course, is how?
Right.
How can that happen? And there's two explanations, and I don't know which one is more frightening. Okay, explanation number one, he basically stopped believing in Scripture when he started believing in Donald Trump, right? In other words, whatever he said or professed to say he believed, he's not as worried about that as he was about his political career. And, you know, teaming up was obviously the only way because he'd lost all the respect in Indiana, even from business Republicans after that anti-gay stuff. And so the only way he could advance would be to team up with this philandering, formerly pro-choice, ex-Democrat guy who's now the Republican nominee, right? That's explanation number one. Explanation number two is that he thinks God wants this. And if you really think about that, it's really dark. The idea that the God that I read about in Scripture wants America to go through this, wants this sort of person to be in power.
And Jesus said, cage the little children. Yeah.
I mean, what? And maybe he does. Maybe he thinks it's part of a plan. But what an insult to God that would be. So I don't know which of those two explanations is true, but there's a lot of people back in Indiana trying to figure it out.
So you brought up a bunch of, You brought up a bunch of things in that conversation. One of which, again, gets back this idea that personal experience, like how does that inform someone's policy views? I've heard you're gay.
Yes, technically,
Right.
yes.
And like you mentioned, I was going to see if we could actually get through the entire interview without mentioning it. But since you brought
Why?
up Pence, well, I think it'd be an interesting like experiment. But since you brought up Pence, and since you brought up your personal relationship with him,
Yeah.
I feel like, I mean, does it feel personal to you? Like his
Well, one of the things
hatred?
No, I mean, one of the things first of all, he's a very polite guy. I
Right.
mean, just because he has fanatical positions doesn't mean he was ever interpersonally mean to me when we were in the room together.
Right.
But also, part of your job when you're in office is to make sure you keep the personal is supposed to inform
Right.
what you do. It's supposed to help you become. It's supposed to be a source of solidarity and empathy with other people. It's not supposed to be a constraint on your thinking, where you think, because I am in this category, I'm going to make sure that policies benefit people in my category. It's supposed to be, in my case, because I'm gay, I know a little bit about what it's like to be othered. And I know a lot about what's at stake in equality, and I know a lot about what's at stake in decisions that are made in the courts. But I try to use that as a way to understand not just why, gay equality and gay rights is so important, but also, for other people who've had a radically different experience than I have as Americans. But maybe it gives me something in common, some basis for better appreciating their point of view and becoming a better public official for it. So I try never to let it be personal in that sense, even though, as I've said and as I've argued in the book, on some level, all politics is personal because it's personal for the people who are voting on what our futures are going to be like.
So you said you feel like, because you're gay, you have some experience with what it's like to be othered.
Yeah.
At one point in the book, you kind of have a reverie about the old South Bend,
Yeah.
you know, what it might be like to visit downtown when it was bustling and the Studebaker factory was churning out Studebakers. And then you do mention, you know, at the end of this little bit of a nostalgic reverie that, of course, the bad news about that nostalgia is that there's a bunch of people that would not be equal under the eyes of the law in this vision of when America was so-called great. To me, that passage was an acknowledgement, acknowledgement of the kind of unearned benefits that come with being white, you know, that come with being male.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, and we call it privilege sometimes, what is your experience with becoming aware of your own privilege?
Well, I had one in college. This is largely a story about how naive I was, but...
actually, that's privilege.
Yes, that's right, because you can get away with being naive. I remember I was standing outside my dorm. I was on my way home from a party or something. I ran into a friend, and he had an acquaintance with him, and we were chatting. And at some point, I noticed that she was smoking a joint. And just out of curiosity, I was like a little bit of left. I was like, "Oh, is that?" And she handed it to me. And I didn't smoke a lot in college, but I don't know. I picked it up, I guess, and I was like, "Oh, I swear, at exactly, precisely this instant, a police car drives by, university police." And I thought, well, that's got to go over the shoulder. Guy sees it, gets out.
Right.
He says, "What was that?" I was like, a little bit paralyzed. I'm not going to be like, it was hers, right? And it's there on the ground, and I'm like, who knows what I was saying. But he picks it up. He finds it. He picks it up. It's like, "Who do you think you are, smoking this?" You know, he's just like kind of
was he an Irish cop that was like...
Probably.
Yeah. Because you went to school in Boston.
Who do you think you are with this? Yeah, I was at Harvard. And, what is this, a roach on the street? And I said, because I did not understand what he was saying, "What's a roach, officer?" This was not helpful. And then he's just, "You fucking arrogant Harvard kids think you can go out here and just smoke this, whatever." You know, there's this tirade. And then my hands are on the back of the trunk, and he's going through my pockets trying to see if I got anything more on me. And then he yells a few more obscenities. And then just as I'm getting ready to take a ride with him, he drives off. That was it. It's a funny story I can tell about my college days. A lot of people had probably the exact same experience and would not have been believed and would have been a lot worse than yelled at and would not have slept in their own beds that night, and maybe would have been derailed in their college career because of it. And it's one of many reasons why I think we've got to end the war on drugs and move to legalization of marijuana. But besides that individual policy on that, it's a good idea, right?
This is Austin. That's like...
But never mind that individual policy on that individual
right
drug.
now. So.
You know, think about that. That's a funny story to me, or that can be a funny story for me. Yeah. And if I were not white, the odds of that having been something that would have derailed my life are exponentially higher. So that's one of many moments when I learned a thing or two about privilege.
And the other thing you brought up in your wonderful monologue about Mike Pence and The Handmaid's Tale that's coming.
He's way too much a part of this interview.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. I don't like to give him that real estate either, but you mentioned faith.
Yeah.
Which is something I was a little disappointed to see not really a huge part of your book. But it seems like it's a pretty big part of your life.
Yeah.
So I wonder, how does faith show up in your life?
Well, first of all, I try to live a life that is consistent with Christian teachings. I know that it is my responsibility not to ever do anything that would, in public life, that would not be equally beneficial or make as much sense to people of another faith or people of no faith. But in my life, I believe in that Christian ethic, the idea that was drilled into me in Catholic school. Even though I'm not Catholic, I'm Episcopalian. But that idea of the imitation of Christ. And this sense that when God himself comes to earth, he is rejected in many ways, largely because he tells the truth. He concerns himself with what's going on with those who are marginalized. He understands his role on earth not to be glorified, but to serve. Foot washing is one of the most powerful images in the New Testament, I think. Foot washing. Feet are gross. And even more so then, right? Not what you would expect the divine to be doing when he comes down to earth. And then the Old Testament, full of the complexity of trying to be in contact with the absolute, wrestling with God, these images that you have. And so I try to live a life that's consistent with that, and I try to think about, I try to be attentive. I'm a rationalist, right? I'm an enlightenment kind of guy. But I also know that there are limits on where reason can take you, especially in public life, where a lot of the problems I deal with are not technical problems that have a right answer, right? If there's like, how can I treat wastewater at 10% less of the cost, right? That has like a right or wrong answer. If we can figure out a way to do it, then by definition we should do it. But if the question is, there's no way to have these people's rates go down without those people's rates going up, that's a moral question in the end of the day. It's how do you want to share a burden? And we need more than technical tools to deal with that. And we need moral reasoning. And in my own experience, faith is a helpful way to tune ourselves to that need.
When's the last time you prayed?
In church, I guess, Ash Wednesday in the morning. I find prayer to be challenging. I'm liturgically conservative. I like to pray in church when we are all saying prayers at the same time, because I think that's a communal act of tuning our hearts in a certain way. I have trouble with the traditional formats for prayer just because I have trouble, grammatically. No, this is important. So, grammar, you have the different moods in grammar. One of them is the imperative mood, do, go, right? It's kind of odd to me that when we, at least in the Christian tradition, usually when we pray, we grammatically are in the imperative mood, which means we're telling God what to do. Now, I get that there's a lot more to prayer to that, and it really has to do, that there's an entire theology behind why we do this. But personally, I think prayer is mostly about making sure that I am tuned. The prayer that makes the most sense to me is, that may we delight in thy will and walk in thy ways, which is about what we're supposed to do, right? Not like telling God what he's supposed to do.
We can have a whole separate conversation about prayer, many thoughts that people here might not be interested in. But one thing that's really important to me about prayer that I heard somewhere is that prayer isn't about, getting what you want from God. Prayer is about the discipline of asking for it. Yeah. It's about the feeling of powerlessness that comes with going on your knees and saying, these are things that I cannot solve. These are the things that I offer up to you.
Well, in faith, like public service, to me is very much about, at the end of the day, it's about humility.
Yeah. And that actually reminds me, I wanted to ask you, when is the last time you felt powerless?
We had our first fatality of the year in gun violence fatality. A young man, Adrian is his name. I think he was 16. And when I go to the vigils that we have. The good news is we had 9. Well, it's not good news. That's the thing. The good news is that 9 homicides last year is dramatically down from when I was a kid. We had more than 20 in a city our size. but every one of those obviously feels like a failure. And we've done so much on gun violence. We implemented this group violence intervention strategy that I think is the best thinking out of John Jay College and the National Network for Safe Communities. And we've got law enforcement and the faith community and the social sector working together. And I'm proud of it. And we do good things. And I think we've saved lives. But nothing makes you more powerless than when you're there with the family of someone who lost their child to gun violence. And you're supposed to be in charge, the mayor, and I think there's also a feeling, an informal feeling of, because we project, especially, the law enforcement side of government, projects a kind of omnipotence or omniscience, to where it almost feels like if somebody died, it's because we let them. Mm. And so I never feel more powerless, at least as a mayor, than when I'm in a situation like that, dealing with gun violence, where we just, we're fighting it with one hand tied behind our back because the state won't let us do a lot of things I think would be commonsensical. You just feel about that big. On a lighter note, I often feel powerless when Chasten and I are negotiating over household chores. Yes.
I'm trying to think if there's a way to say he's always right, maybe.
He's always right.
Okay. Or no. Well, one of the things that you return to in the book, and one of the things that sort of convinced me that being a mayor is perhaps a better preparation for president than legislative office or even governor, is that you become kind of okay with how much of the job is ceremonial, how much of the job has to do with being a symbol. I mean, I think that gets to the consoler-in-chief role that you play when it comes to gun violence. And you write that was hard for you to come to that because you're analytical, you've mentioned that, you're a tech guy, and also you're an introvert. So talk a little more about that journey to becoming okay with being that symbol.
Yeah, so I write about it in the book, and a lot of it had to do with moments where I needed to comfort people in a situation like that. Also moments where I got to celebrate the comeback of the city. So we were being written off as a dying city at the beginning of this decade, and we began to see through, I'd like to believe, a lot of good policy work that we did. We saw a return of jobs, we saw a return of people, we saw the city growing again, and I wanted to find a way to assert that. And what I realized was for all the statistics I can point to, the real victories are when the city starts to believe in itself again. And I began to understand that that's a really important part of the job. It's another thing that being married to Chasten has helped with too, because I think, my first term I was solo. So I think it puts you that much more in the kind of just put your head down, get the job done side of the job. And he's very attuned to the extent to which we have the ability just to, if we go out and swing by a high school where they're doing a play or go through a downtown event or attend an opening of some kind, we're conferring a kind of legitimacy and a kind of city celebration on whatever somebody's project is that we're there to help them with, just by showing up. And it feels weird because I'm a substantive guy, and they're not asking me to contribute to their business plan or to, help out with the school play or whatever the thing is. I'm not doing a thing that I would think of as meaningful in a tactical sense.
Right.
But
doesn't show up on a balance sheet, doesn't
right. Yeah. But we can make people feel better, and we can elevate their sense of importance in a healthy way. And so I've become much more attuned. We got married during my re-election, so my second term has been different than my first. And part of that role that you have, merely by showing up, I've come to acknowledge is actually a really important part of the job, because you can help legitimize what other people are doing when it's good.
So one of the reasons why, again, by your argument that being mayor is good preparation for president, is I feel like a lot of people who come to the job from, legislative office, Senate or House, or even the gubernatorial office, feel like there's more power to the presidency than there really is. I think you seem to have a really good understanding of what the limits of the job are. And one of the things you say about being mayor, for example, is the most important thing you have is political capital.
Yeah.
That is, and I think that's true of the presidential office as well. So, on day one, where do you spend your political capital?
Democracy. Because to me, every issue I care about, I think climate change is a major emergency. I think that we've got to do more on healthcare and wages and paid family leave. There's a whole set of policy things I can talk about. But the question, I think, of our moment is how are there so many widely popular policy ideas that Washington can't just deliver? I mean, comprehensive immigration reform is a good example. But also very specific things like universal background checks. Just passed the House. This is something that enjoys 80% support from Republicans, but not from members of Congress who are Republican. And so because money can outvote people, because districts are drawn to where politicians are choosing their voters instead of the other way around, because of a court system that's gotten twisted, for all these reasons, the outcomes don't reflect what the American people actually want. And if we don't fix the democracy, if we don't take steps to rein in money in politics and make sure more people can vote and so on, I think we will never really succeed in managing these other policy issues because our engine, our policy machinery, is broken.
So we've gotten to... Sure. We're about 15 minutes away from having to wrap up, and I promised myself I'd wait till this point to fight with you. So I want to read something to you from your book.
Okay.
Which is, I like this passage. Progress could only begin once the loss had been fully metabolized. Nothing is more human than to resist loss, which is why cynical politicians can get pretty far by offering up the fantasy that a loss can be reversed rather than overcome the hard way. Now, in that particular passage, I think you're talking about the industrial Midwest and policies about manufacturing.
Right.
And being from the industrial Midwest has kind of been a fairly big part of your selling point for yourself.
Yeah.
Like you, a part of the country that has gone pretty red, and you're from there. I read that passage and I kept thinking of, I think it's true of jobs, industrial, manufacturing jobs in the Midwest. Those aren't coming back. But I also thought of white working class voters. They're not coming back either. I don't think. But you kind of make an argument here that that's something that the Democrat Party should think about doing. Like,
when you say coming back, you mean coming back to the Democratic Party, or do you mean coming back in terms of succeeding?
Oh, I mean, success can happen. I mean coming back to the Democratic Party. Like, I think, you actually have a couple of passages in here about, like, Democrats, elite Democrats, write off the industrial Midwest. They condescend to this area of the country. I'm someone that can make overtures towards it. No one else is talking about this. Everyone else is talking about this. I feel like the fight right now in the Democratic primary is who can do the most outreach to Trump voters. Like, and I want to ask, like, why can't we let that go? Why can't we let that go in the same way we're letting go of other things that aren't coming back?
Because there is more joy in heaven if one sheep comes from... No, look, this is important. Because they're human beings, because we're related to them.
No, but they're human beings. They're redeemable people. But why should Democrats pander to their vote? A Democratic president hasn't gotten over 50% of the white vote since the 60s. And it's decreased every election since then.
Right, but we got to ask about some of the reasons why, right? So are we really willing to accept that people can keep doing what this president does and use race to divide us within the class? Why should look, there were a lot of, I think we could get a couple more than that, yeah.
It shouldn't work, but it does.
But it shouldn't, so we shouldn't let it. Look, the progressive tradition is largely built out in the Midwest. I mean, William Jennings Bryan, Eugene Debs, an outright socialist from Indiana. It goes all the way back to John Brown in Kansas. Yeah. And, especially when you note that there are a lot of black and brown working class people who voted exactly the way we hoped they would.
Sure.
So why are we willing to allow white working class people to be cleaved off? Look, you think about the psychology of people who choose to vote for this president. And if the reason you're voting for him is you're just really into racism, for example, then I'm never going to...
The number one predictor for voting for Donald Trump was racial resentment.
Yeah, so I'm not interested in winning over a committed racist. But there are a lot
What about the uncommitted racists? Those are the gettable ones?
You know how you know? There are a whole bunch of people, just as a matter of mathematics, who must, in our county, who must have voted for Barack Obama, Donald Trump, Mike Pence, and me. Which means there's a lot of different things explaining these voting preferences. And at a time when the interests of working people have probably never been more aligned against the governing class, in my lifetime. I can't imagine us slipping toward a world. Here's the world we could be going into. It's not that different from the 50s or the 20s. You got one party, used to be the Republican Party, which is concentrated in the cities, socially forward-leaning, better on race, but also definitely more interested in the concerns of the elite. And then you got the other party, used to be the Democratic Party, definitely the one more authentically the party of the working person. Stay with me. Concentrated in the heartland, worried about workers and farmers, but happens to be home to many of the worst racist and nativist elements in American politics. I don't want those two to be my choices, just flipping the labels over. And that could happen if we let it. So let's not let it.
I feel like the only place that that's happening is on Fox News. Like, that's the way that they portray the Democratic Party. Do you honestly believe the Democratic Party doesn't care about the Midwest? Because, I mean, look at who's running.
No, it's not that people don't care, although it's interesting that we got, maybe 2 Midwestern voices in the 2020 conversation out of, like, 20 people, right? That's kind of interesting.
Sure.
Because that used to be the heart of our party. And, yeah, like, we all get that we need to win Ohio. I'm not talking about that.
But how do you win Ohio? How do you win Wisconsin?
Well, here's what you don't do.
Right.
You don't show up in Ohio, find a bunch of working class dudes, and say, you're voting against your economic interests.
But no politician actually does that. Like, that's like Tom Frank does that.
But you get it you pick it up in the blogosphere and in the media.
Oh, those guys are reading blogs and feeling like they're watching Fox News and they're getting.
They're watching what their liberal cousin posts on Facebook and beats him over the head with and makes him feel small.
I don't know why I feel so strongly about this, but it's just like...
I mean, are we just going to give up on people?
No, you don't give up on people, and you should enact policies that benefit those people.
Those people?
Yeah, people.
Yeah.
I mean, like, I live in Minneapolis, right? Like, I live in the Midwest.
That was a cheap shot. I'm sorry.
And like,
but you know what I mean? Like, we see them as those people, and even
I don't see them as. I see what kind of modifier should I have used? Like, I mean, I know you're just giving me a hard time.
Yeah, I am.
It's fine.
I'm sorry.
But these are my people.
Right.
Like, I am from the Midwest. Like,
I mean, let's think of it a different way. Let's think of it in terms of when you have someone and
what I get concerned about. Let me sort of lay out. I feel like I need to say why this is something that I care about. It's because when the national conversation in Democratic politics comes, how do we win over the white people?
Yeah.
Like, I think the real base of the Democratic Party starts to get turned off. And what happened with Hillary Clinton wasn't that she didn't win the white people, which she didn't. It was that people of color didn't turn out for her.
Right. No, I'm with you here. If for a second it means, walking away or downplaying our commitment on things like racial justice, or our insistence on inclusion, or our expectation that this generation will see a more enlightened reality on gender and race and LGBTQ equality and the rest. If it means for a second that we're going to relax our commitment to that, then I'm right there with you. That's where I get off. I just refuse to accept that it has to mean that.
You're going to do very well on national television.
I hope so.
People want to hear that. I know. Darn it. So I do want to do a policy corner speed round.
Great.
You've addressed a bunch of these things in other interviews, so you don't need to, people can Google you. But I am interested. Okay. Filibuster, go.
Should be reconsidered.
Okay. Court packing.
I can't give you a 5-word answer on court packing. I can give you like a 30-word answer.
Okay, give me a 30-word answer.
All right, we need Supreme Court reform to make sure that it doesn't become a nakedly political institution. Adding justices is worth opening the debate about, but it's not really fixing the problem. Other ways to fix the problem, there are models that have been floated, like one where you would have 10 justices appointed politically, and then 5 more on a 15-member court who can only be seated by unanimous consensus of the other 10. So then you have at least 5 who think for themselves.
Like a fraternity.
What's that?
It would be like a fraternity. Hopefully not literally a fraternity, but like...
No, but there would have to be that consensus.
Yeah.
And it just takes anything that will stop the next vacancy from being this apocalyptic ideological fight we got to be open to. And by the way, a lot of these things can be done without amending the Constitution. So I think the so-called court packing conversation pries the door open for an actually even richer and higher stakes conversation, which is what should the Supreme Court look like so it doesn't look like this?
one of the things I like, I've heard you talk about this before, and one of the things I want to kind of make sure that to unearth from that answer is the idea that one reason we should consider Supreme Court reform isn't because we should get more justices. It's that this has become this apocalyptic, sort of issue for people.
Yeah, it's
in
not just the
voting.
Supreme
that
Court.
That it's like the number, it's a make or break issue for people that are pro-life. That's like the only thing that they can vote on is like whether or not the Supreme Court will do this. And we want to undo that somehow.
Right. Yes.
So good on you. Yay. Adding states.
Yeah. D.C., how is it that we've just accepted for who knows how long that fellow U.S. citizens in D.C. Don't get a senator? Well, 2, to be specific.
Yeah.
It's not fair. It's not fair. It's not right. It's kind of some vestigial thing that we've just accepted, and I don't think we should accept it anymore. Similar with Puerto Rico's a little more different because they've got to make their own decisions, but if they're prepared for statehood, then we've got to welcome them too.
Reparations?
So I think we've got to target our policies in a way that redress economic inequity. There's a lot of different ways to do that. To me, it has to do with making sure, obviously, criminal justice policy and reform, but also that economic policies are viewed through this lens when we know that the status quo disproportionately harms people of color in ways that are connected to structural racism, past and present, and that we target a lot of our interventions with a view toward whatever areas of U.S. policy and political life are most unequal.
I think you just put yourself to the right of David Brooks.
I hope not.
I mean, his column came out in favor of reparations, and I didn't hear I am in favor of reparations from you.
Look, it's one of these words that's being used as a political cudgel because nobody can explain definitionally what it actually means. So...
Odd applause line, but okay.
So, I mean, if we can structure something that
Yeah.
that meets that goal,
Right.
Again, I think we're probably best served doing it through policy, but we should have that conversation.
Equal Rights Amendment.
Yes.
Good. Okay. Right answer. So you are...
Speaking of the Equal Rights Amendment,
Oh, go.
Birch Bayh of Indiana was authoring and sponsoring amendments like that and several others, just 40 or 50 years ago. So the idea that we can't ever do anything that would require constitutional change is a bit silly because he was doing this in the 70s and he was not some loony lefty, right? It was back then regarded as common sense that we should tune up our Constitution with everything from lowering the voting age to 18 to the 25th Amendment, which I'm afraid might come in handy one day, to make our democracy stronger.
I feel like as a millennial, I cannot let you go without doing some millennial things. I'm not going to ask you to make avocado toast, but I will ask you to confess your unpopular opinion.
This is what?
Confess your unpopular opinion.
Oh, right. This is like a thing.
This is a hashtag.
Yeah. I'm getting a little blowback on the hot dog sandwich thing. I think a hot dog is not a
Is
sandwich.
it? Oh, okay.
And apparently a
Controversial.
lot of people are really committed to a hot dog being a sandwich. You're with me, right? Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Well, I got like 4 supporters here on that one. So.
Okay.
Here's another one. This is a little riskier, but I've realized, admittedly to my dismay, that the song Walk Like an Egyptian is actually interesting, both lyrically and musically. I surprised myself with this discovery. I'm not proud of it. But you should look into this.
We're going to do a sidebar on that after this. Tune in. Regrettable fashion trend from the 90s?
Chasten's perking up over there because he considers most of my personal choices to be a regrettable fashion trend. But then he makes sure that I don't walk out and embarrass myself. From the 90s, you said?
Well, I was going to say, for the most fashion trend that you followed in the 90s.
Oh.
I'm giving you a way out here. Just assume Chasten's taking care of current events.
Yeah, I mean, the bagginess was probably a mistake.
The bagginess?
Yeah.
I think we all fell victim to the bagginess.
It's coming back, though.
Yeah.
It's just
I am also
time.
now, as an old person, falling victim to bagginess. My skin. What is your superpower?
Circular breathing.
What?
Circular breathing. You need to do it in order to play the didgeridoo. You store up a couple seconds of. It's not actually physically possible to breathe in and out at the same time. But what you do is you store a little bit of air in your mouth, and then you force it out while you're sharply inhaling, and then you can keep playing a note for like 3 minutes on a didgeridoo. It's pretty cool.
Your most on-brand childhood story.
Oh. I don't know. Somebody told a story recently where I was with like a 3-year-old playmate, and we were. She was like her mom. She's the mom, and she's watching me and her daughter like playing, and I would run up and hit her on the head, and then she would run up and hit me on the head, and we just took turns doing that, and she finally came out and asked us like, "What are you doing? We don't hit each other." And one of us explained we're playing Monster, and she said, "Well, that doesn't mean it's okay to hit each other." And apparently, I said, "Well, that's what monsters do."
I'm having trouble fitting that into on-brandness, and now I'm a little scared.
I'm for decency. It's my.
Oh,
it's
okay.
my brand.
Okay. All right. You're for decency. Well, I will say that when I first got this assignment, I thought this was going to be kind of a piece of cake because I wouldn't be nervous. But then I read your book and I listened to some of your interviews, and I thought, oh no, I might be interviewing the next president of the United States. So I hope I can count on you for a pardon. Just put that in your back pocket. Thank you.
Thank you. It's an honor to be with you. Thanks, everyone.